I didn't open the envelope at the dining room table, even though that's where he handed it to me. I didn't open it in front of my stepfather, or my stepsister, or the real estate attorney sitting across from us with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. I took it, tucked it under my arm, and walked outside to the driveway. Not because I wasn't ready, because I wanted to be standing on my own 2 feet when everything he built finally came down. That moment had taken me 26 years to reach. My name is Claire. I'm 28 years old. I teach 3rd grade at an elementary school in Columbus, Ohio, and for most of my life, the man who raised me made sure I understood that I was lucky he'd done so at all. He didn't call me a burden in front of company. He was smarter than that. He waited until we were alone, or until it was just me and my stepsister Leah in the room, and then it would come quiet, almost casual, the way you'd remind someone of a rule they already knew. You understand you wouldn't have any of this without me. Or, I want you to remember that I didn't have to do this. Or, on the worst nights, just, you're not really mine, Claire. You never were. I was 4 years old the first time I remember him saying it. My mother married my stepfather, Walter, when I was 3. My biological father had left before I could form a clear memory of him. He was 22, she was 21, and neither of them was ready for what they'd made. He signed over his parental rights without a fight. My mother told me this gently, the way she told me everything, sitting on the edge of my bed with her hand in mine. She said it didn't mean I wasn't wanted. She said it just meant that sometimes love and readiness don't show up at the same time. She always had a way of wrapping the painful things in something soft. Walter was different. Walter was organized, ambitious, and careful about appearances. He owned 2 dry cleaning franchises on the east side of Columbus, drove a clean car, wore pressed shirts on weekends. When he married my mother, her friends told her she'd done well. He was dependable, stable, a real provider, her mother said at the wedding, which I apparently attended in a white dress and refused to eat anything but the dinner rolls. What her friends and her mother didn't see was what happened after the door closed. He wasn't violent. I want to be clear about that, because people sometimes assume the worst when they hear stories like mine. And what Walter did was more precise than violence. He was strategic with his cruelty. He had a daughter of his own, Leah, 2 years older than me from his first marriage, and the line between how he treated her and how he treated me was so consistent, so deliberate, that it couldn't have been accidental. Leah got the new backpack every August. I got the one from the year before, cleaned up. Leah's school photos went on the mantle. Mine went in a drawer. When Leah made the honor roll, Walter took her out for ice cream. When I did, he nodded and went back to his newspaper. "She's not blood," I once heard him tell my mother, late at night when they thought I was asleep. "I'm doing what I can, but she's not blood," my mother argued. She always argued, but she also always stayed, and I used to lie in bed trying to understand the gap between those two things. I think now that she was afraid not of him, exactly, but of what leaving would mean. She'd already had one marriage fall apart. She had a daughter with no father on record. She had built something functional, if not warm, and she didn't know how to let it go. She got sick when I was 11, breast cancer, caught in the 2nd stage, which the doctors said was manageable. She went through treatment and the cancer retreated, and for 2 years everything felt tentatively okay. Then it came back when I was 15, and this time it didn't retreat. She died 3 weeks after my 16th birthday. I don't know how to write about that in a way that captures what it actually was. The most accurate thing I can say is that when she died, I lost the only person in that house who saw me as fully real. After that, Walter's comments stopped being a low hum in the background and became the main sound of my life. "Your mother carried you for 9 months, and what did your real father do?" "Nothing. I gave you 16 years, and a roof and a name on your school forms. Remember that." As if I had chosen any of this. As if I had engineered my own circumstances at age 3 and should spend the rest of my life grateful for the inconvenience I'd caused him. I survived it the way kids survive things they can't change. I stayed quiet. I stayed small. I made myself useful. And I counted the days. I babysat every weekend through high school. I saved everything. I got a scholarship to Ohio State, and I took it without asking him for anything. And the morning I moved into my dorm, I hugged Leah goodbye and shook Walter's hand and drove away in my 12-year-old Honda and did not cry until I was on the highway. That was Leah's doing. Actually, that I stayed in contact at all. Leah had grown up watching what happened to me in that house, and I think it left a mark on her too. She was never unkind to me. She was careful and sometimes distant, the way children are when they learn early that drawing attention to an injustice usually just spreads the punishment around. But she called me in college. She texted when something happened. When I graduated and got my teaching job and moved into a small apartment in Clintonville, it was Leah who came over with a bottle of wine and spent the night on my couch and said, "I'm proud of you," and meant it. She was the one who called me about the storage unit. Walter had been selling the house. He was 61 now, recently remarried to a woman named Pamela who had her own place in Westerville and found our old house too large and too old, and the decision had been made to sell. He'd called me himself, which surprised me, to let me know that if there was anything of my mother's I wanted, I should come get it before the estate sale. There was a storage unit attached to the property, a detached garage Walter had converted years ago, and my mother had kept things in there that he had never sorted through. Books, boxes, photo albums. The kind of things that accumulate in a life and no one knows what to do with. I went on a Saturday in March. Leah was already there when I arrived, standing in the driveway with 2 cups of coffee, and she handed me one without saying anything. We went through the unit together, quiet in the way we'd learned to be comfortable with, pulling boxes toward the light. Most of it was ordinary. Old textbooks from my mother's one semester of community college. Christmas decorations she'd saved from her own childhood. A bag of my baby clothes that made me sit down on an overturned crate and take a long breath. The journals were in a shoebox on the top shelf, behind a broken lamp and a rolled-up poster of a landscape I didn't recognize. There were 4 of them, small, cloth-covered, the kind sold at craft stores, and they were filled with my mother's handwriting from front to back. The dates started around the time she met Walter and ran through the first few years of their marriage. I didn't read them there. I put them in my bag and told Leah I was taking them, and she nodded like she'd expected it. On the drive home, I kept the bag on the passenger seat and didn't touch it. I read the first journal that night, sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and a glass of water I forgot about. My mother's voice came off those pages so cleanly that it felt physical, like standing in a room where someone's perfume is still in the air. She wrote about small things, what she cooked for dinner, something funny I'd said, a book she was reading. And then, threading through those small things, the bigger ones, her doubts about Walter. The way he pulled back from her when she showed any sign of independence. A line that stopped me so completely I read it 4 times. He acts as though Claire is the proof of something shameful. I've started to wonder if she reminds him of something he's done, not something I've done. I set the journal down. I thought about that sentence for a long time. Then I picked up the second journal and kept reading. The 4th journal was the one that changed everything. My mother had written it during her first round of chemotherapy, when she was tired and probably less guarded than she'd normally have let herself be. The handwriting was looser than the earlier volumes, less even. She wrote about wanting more time. And on a page near the middle, she wrote about a phone call she had intercepted by accident, Walter's cell phone left on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, a name that appeared on the screen she recognized. A woman named Sandra who worked at the dry cleaning supply company Walter used for his franchises. A name she had seen on a credit card statement earlier that year at a restaurant in a part of the city Walter had no business reason to be in. My mother had picked up the call by reflex. She hadn't said anything. She had listened to a woman's voice ask where he was, and then she'd set the phone down and walked to the back porch and stood there for a long time. She wrote, "I think he has been seeing her for years. I think it started before we were married. I think the reason he holds Claire's origins against her is because he needed someone to blame for his own inability to be faithful. If he could make her the proof of my flaws, he could justify everything he was doing behind my back." She was 4 years old. She has been carrying something that was never hers to carry. I closed the journal, I sat on my kitchen floor, and I let myself feel every single thing that came up, and then I got up and washed my face and went to bed. I didn't do anything with what I knew for 6 weeks. I want to explain that, because some people would wonder why. The truth is that finding out the reason for something doesn't immediately fix what the something did to you. I had 24 years of accumulated weight that I had to sit with and process and understand differently. That takes time. It doesn't happen the night you find the journals. But I also wasn't going to let it go. I contacted the woman named Sandra through a mutual connection on LinkedIn. She had left the supply company and started her own small business, and her profile was public. I didn't introduce myself right away. I sent a message that said I was doing some personal research and believed she might have known my mother, and asked if she'd be willing to speak. She responded in 3 days. We spoke on the phone for 40 minutes. She was not what I expected. She was quiet, measured, clearly carrying her own weight about the past. She told me she and Walter had ended things over 15 years ago. She told me she had known about me, known that there was a stepdaughter, that Walter complained about the situation, that he had made clear I was a complication he hadn't signed up for. She told me she had always felt uncomfortable about that, and that it was one of the reasons she had eventually stepped back. And then she said something I hadn't expected at all. She said, "He told me once, early on, that the reason he stayed with your mother was because he'd gotten another woman pregnant around the time they started dating, and he needed the relationship to look solid. He needed the appearance of a stable family man. She gave him that. And you came with her, and he resented it, but he also couldn't leave, because leaving would have unraveled the whole story he was telling about himself." I thanked her and ended the call and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I thought about my mother. I thought about her sitting on the edge of my bed, wrapping painful things in something soft. I thought about what she had suspected and never said aloud, and what she had quietly written in journals she must have known I would someday find. I think she left them for me. I don't think it's an accident that they were preserved while so much else wasn't. I think she wanted me to know, eventually, when I was old enough to hold it without it breaking me. The house sale closing was scheduled for a Saturday in May. Walter had asked both me and Leah to be there to sign off on a few items related to our mother's estate. Small formalities, the attorney had said, nothing complicated. I told Leah what I had found about 2 weeks before that date. We sat in her car in a parking lot near her apartment, and I told her everything. The journals, Sandra, the phone call, all of it. Leah was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I always knew something was wrong in that house. I just couldn't find the edges of it." She asked what I wanted to do. I told her I didn't want to cause a scene. I didn't want to blow anything up. I wanted to do one specific thing, and then I wanted to leave. And she was welcome to come with me, or she could stay. And either way, I would understand. She said, "I'm coming with you." The closing was in the dining room of the old house, which felt strange sitting at the table I'd eaten at my whole childhood, in a room that was half empty now, boxes stacked along the walls, the mantel already bare. Walter was there with Pamela, who was polite and clearly uncomfortable, and probably did not know the full history of what she'd married into. The attorney had his papers spread out, and his glasses on. It was all very orderly. After the papers were signed, and the attorney was packing his briefcase, Walter slid an envelope across the table toward me. He said it was some paperwork he'd found in the storage unit that he thought I should have. He said it like he was doing me a favor. He had the same expression he'd worn my entire childhood, that slightly pained, slightly impatient look. The one that said, "I am being very patient with you, and I hope you appreciate that." I looked at the envelope. I picked it up. And then I reached into my bag and placed my mother's 4th journal on the table in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at me. His expression shifted not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies, but in the small, incremental way of a person who has been found out and is still deciding whether to admit it. I said, "I've read everything she wrote. I spoke to Sandra. I kept my voice level. I'm not going to make a scene. I don't need you to apologize or explain. I've been carrying something that was never mine to carry, and I'm setting it down now. That's all." He didn't say anything. Pamela was very still. The attorney had stopped packing his briefcase. Leah stood up from her chair and came to stand beside me, and she put her hand on my arm. And that was it. That was the whole thing. It wasn't a confrontation with fireworks. It wasn't a speech. It was just the truth, said out loud, in the room where the lie had lived for so long. I picked up my bag and the envelope. I looked at Walter one more time, not with hatred, because I realized standing there that I didn't have enough of it left to be worth carrying, and then I nodded at Pamela and I walked out the front door of that house for the last time. Leah was right behind me. We sat on the porch steps in the May sunlight for a minute, and neither of us said anything. Then Leah laughed a small, shaky sound and said, "I can't believe you just did that." And I said, "I can't either." And we sat there another minute and then I said, "I'm hungry. Let's go get breakfast." And she said yes. And we left. I opened the envelope later that morning at a diner 3 miles away, over eggs and coffee. It was old paperwork, like Walter had said, some documents from when my mother had made him my legal guardian, signed in the year after they married. Papers that had never meant anything except that a man had agreed, once, on paper, to be responsible for me, and had spent the next 2 decades making sure I knew how much it had cost him. I folded them and put them back in the envelope and set it on the corner of the table. I thought about what I wanted to keep from that chapter of my life. Not bitterness, because that would mean he continued to take up space. Not the label he'd stuck to me, not really mine. Never really mine because that had never been true and I was done lending it any of my energy. What I wanted to keep was my mother's handwriting on those pages. The way she had loved me, quietly and consistently, even in the middle of everything that was being done to her. The way she had seen clearly what was happening and had chosen to leave me a record of it, tucked on a high shelf behind a broken lamp, waiting for me to be ready. And Leah. I wanted to keep Leah. She is not my blood. We share no biology at all. We grew up in the same house, shaped by the same unhealthy dynamic, watching each other from a careful distance, and over time we became something that I think is rarer and more deliberate than most family bonds. We chose each other. We made a decision, independent of our shared history, to keep showing up. That is not nothing. In fact, of everything that came out of that house, it might be the thing I value most. There's a woman at my school, Mrs. Tran, the 3rd grade teacher next door to my classroom, who has become something like family to me over the last 4 years. She is 63 years old, Vietnamese American, and she teaches with a precision and warmth that I have studied and tried to replicate. When I first started at the school, overwhelmed and unsure of myself, she had a habit of stopping by my classroom at the end of the day and asking how things had gone, not in a supervisory way. In the way of someone who remembers what the beginning felt like and wants to make it less hard for whoever's coming next. She never made me feel small. She never gave me help in a way that felt like a transaction. I think about her sometimes when I think about what Walter used to say. I didn't have to do this. As if care is only meaningful when it costs something. As if love is an act of charity that obligates the recipient forever. What I have learned from Mrs. Tran, from Leah, from my mother's soft way of explaining hard things, is that the people who make you feel most seen are usually not the ones who remind you what they sacrificed. They just show up. They just stay. And they never once ask you to be grateful for it. I still have the journals. They're on the shelf in my apartment, between a plant that needs more sun than I give it, and a photo of me and Leah at her birthday last year. I don't read them often. I don't need to read them to know what's in them. But I like knowing they're there. I like knowing my mother's voice exists somewhere in a physical form I can touch. I like knowing that the truth waited for me, quietly, on a high shelf, until I was ready. A few weeks after the closing, Walter emailed me. It was brief and not exactly an apology, more of an acknowledgement. The kind of thing a person writes when they are aware they should say something, but can't quite bring themselves to say what the something actually is. He wrote that he hoped I was doing well. He wrote that he thought I had turned out fine. He wrote that my mother would have been proud. I read it twice. I thought about responding for about 3 days. Then I decided that the most honest thing I could do, the thing that required the most precision, more than any speech or confrontation, was to simply not respond, not out of cruelty, out of accuracy. There was nothing for me to say that I hadn't already said, standing in that dining room, looking him in the eye. The chapter was finished. I didn't need to write a postscript. What I did instead was drive to my mother's old neighborhood on a Sunday afternoon and sit in the car in front of the house, which already had a new family in it. There were children's bikes on the front porch, and a basketball hoop in the driveway, and a ceramic planter by the door that my mother would have liked. I sat there for about 10 minutes, Then I drove to the cemetery where she's buried, and I sat in the grass beside her stone for a while longer and talked to her, which is something I do sometimes when things feel unresolved, because she was the person I always went to with unresolved things. I told her I had read what she wrote. I told her I understood now what she had meant about Claire reminding him of something he had done. I told her I didn't blame her for staying, because I think I finally understood the geography of that choice, the distance between knowing something is wrong and knowing what to do about it. I told her I was okay. I told her I had people who saw me clearly and showed up without keeping score, and that I thought she would like them. I told her that she had been the first one to do it, and that it was enough, and that it counted, and that I had carried it with me all the way here. I don't know what comes next. I know I am 28 years old and I teach children who occasionally drive me to the edge of sanity and occasionally make me feel like the whole world is still fundamentally workable. I know I have a stepsister who is one of my closest friends, and a mentor down the hall who makes the hard parts easier, and an apartment with too little light and a plant that survives anyway. I know that for 24 years someone told me I was a weight he had agreed to carry, and that I had believed it long enough for it to change the shape of how I moved through the world, careful, small, not wanting to ask for too much. And I know that I am unlearning it, steadily, the way you unlearn anything that was never actually true in the first place. By remembering it isn't. By saying so out loud. By walking out the front door of the house it lived in and not looking back. The envelope from that Saturday is still in my bag. I haven't thrown it away. I'm not sure why I've kept it. Maybe because it was the thing he thought would remind me of what I owed him, and instead it just became the last thing I carried out of their light, folded, already finished. I'll throw it away eventually, when I'm ready. There's no rush. I already know what it says. I already know what it means, and what it doesn't mean, and what it never had the right to mean. I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly who raised me. And those two things, finally, are not the same person.